How did lobbying come to dominate Washington, D.C. so thoroughly? Brody Mullins is a former reporter at the Wall Street Journal and the author of the new book, The Wolves of K Street. He joins the show to talk about how lobbying grew from a sleepy, small industry to a massive influence on our national politics. We talk about how lobbyists influence policymakers and what a better system might look like. As always, thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the podcast, make sure to like, comment, subscribe. And if you really love the podcast, we would appreciate your support. You can become a member of the Center for New Liberalism at cnliberalism.org/become a member. The Center for New Liberalism sponsors this podcast. They're the reason we're here. And so if you like the podcast and you want it to keep going, become a member of CNL today. Thanks for listening and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me today is Brody Mullins. Brody, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, I first want to start off with this book, which was a really, really fascinating read. I feel like I learned a lot about how Washington operates by reading this book, The Wolves of K Street. But
well, thank you.
Before we get into a lot of the details, I'm curious kind of what motivated this book in particular. Why write about this? Why write kind of a history of the modern lobbying industry, essentially, in D.C.?
Well, there's a couple answers to that. Writing a book is never simple. There's never, one motivation. And first of all, thank you for the compliment of the history. I learned a ton about the history of Washington, even though I'm a native Washingtonian, and I learned a ton about the history of lobbying, even though I've covered lobbying for 20 years, and we can get into all that. So I had covered lobbying in businesses and how business and industries try to get what they want in Washington since the early 2000s. I've read a lot of stories about how companies use campaign donations and hire lobbyists and pay academics and fund think tanks in order to shape legislation and policy in DC. But I never really thought that I had it in me to write a book. It's hard enough to find the time to read books. I didn't think I'd ever find the time to write a book or really have a reason to write a book. And then in 2015, I was covering the lobbying industry, and a very prominent pharmaceutical industry lobbyist named Evan Morris ended up dead on a golf course. And I started looking into him, and after about a year of researching his life, I found out that he was involved in a kickback effort with one of his consultants who was actually stealing money from his company and had ended up killing himself. And what I realized over time by writing a story for the Wall Street Journal, in fact, several stories for the Wall Street Journal, that the story of this guy's rise and fall in Washington, the story of his dramatic climb, his path to riches and fame and wealth, and then his dramatic suicide, really helps tell the story of how Washington itself has changed over the last 50 years, and how corporations have come to power, and how lobbying has changed. And we can get into all that. But my idea was, this is a really dramatic personal story about a really interesting guy. And if told the right way, it really tells the story of modern day Washington. And just one more thing here, it really been almost 40 years since the last good book has been written about Washington and lobbying. And that was a book written in about the 1986 tax bill. And no one had really examined how bills become law and how corporations influence law and how they lobby since that book. And that book is called Showdown at Gucci Gulch, which is like sort of a seminal book on lobbying. And no one had written about the industry since then. So it seemed like there was a big opening for us.
So let's talk about that history, because you mentioned about, how things have changed over the last 50 years. So before we get into kind of the seedy side of Washington, D.C. and the money that flows around and we can argue about whether or not money is the lifeblood of D.C. I'm guessing you have an opinion there. But if we take it back to, like you said, 50 years ago, how did Washington, D.C. work 50 years ago when there was not this version of the modern lobbying industry? Obviously, lobbying your government to lobby has always existed in some form or another for as long as the Republic has existed. And you can even go back to the ancient kings. They all had people coming to them who want stuff, right? Like appealing to the ruler has always existed. But how did this express itself kind of say in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, before kind of the modern lobbying industry really took off?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, for me, learning some of that history was the most fascinating part of our research. And what we found out is that, while companies, the book is really about how companies have come to power in DC. And what we found out is that companies have not always been incredibly influential in Washington. And in fact, before the 1970s, companies had very little influence in Washington, and we can get to that. But more importantly, we found out that the founding fathers envisioned a day in which there would be lobbying. In fact, there would be corporate lobbying. The founding fathers realized that rules and legislation and laws were not going to be created in a vacuum by Congress and the administration, but in fact that there would be pressures from the outside. They didn't call them lobbyists; they called them factions, and they foresaw that there'd be a pro-industry sort of corporate faction, and there'd be a pro-worker faction. The pro-worker faction basically ended up being labor unions, and the pro-industry faction ended up being corporate America. And for most of the next 200 years, those two factions sort of battled each other. They were equal size and equal weight and relatively equal influence, that they sort of battled each other to shape legislation that was compromised. And in fact, from the New Deal in the 1920s to the Great Society in the 1970s, the corporate side actually had less influence than the worker side. Labor unions were incredibly powerful. Consumer groups were incredibly powerful during that period. And as a result of that, they sort of pushed the government to grow. They pushed the size of the bureaucracy to increase. We had dozens and scores of new federal agencies and departments created from the New Deal to the Great Society. It created this big, liberal government that we had during that time. And companies, for the most part, didn't really fight back that hard on the creation of lots of these new rules and regulations from the 1930s to the 1970s, in part because corporate profits were high, companies were doing well, they sponsored the Little League team, they took care of their employees. Sure, they battled with labor unions, but it wasn't really a fight to the death.
Would it be fair to say that, obviously there have always been people who lobby the government, but one of the focuses in your book is kind of on corporate money, and basically back in the day, it was just different interests. Corporate interests were not a big deal compared to, as you say, unions. Even farmers used to be a really, really important lobby, and they would try to get their stuff passed. And certainly we can talk about how the Farm Bill is filled with stuff that is friendly, but it used to be kind of a different set of interests and a different scale.
Yeah, and obviously there were companies, in the 20th century, but they didn't really have much of it. They didn't feel like it was their job to come to Washington and shape the laws and regulations. They thought their job was to, build more trains and cars and manufacture things, and that's what they focused on until the 1970s. Everything changed in the 1970s when the economy cratered with stagflation, with inflation, and corporate profits evaporated, and corporate executives looked around and to figure out who to blame, and they realized all these rules and regulations that have been created in the last 50 years were costing them a ton of money, were stifling economic growth, and were eating into their profits or erasing their profits. So like any good business people, they invested in their problem. They started hiring lobbyists, opening offices in Washington, getting to know their members of Congress, starting political action committees, and really fighting to block new rules and regulations, and eventually going on the offense in Washington, creating rules and regulations that helped corporations and hurt the rest of the country. So that 1970s period was a really huge pivot point when companies went from having no influence to starting their rise to today, where companies are, the single most dominant force in politics. Companies had so little influence in the 1960s and early 1970s that the most powerful influence or lobbyist in Washington was actually Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader in the 1960s and 1970s took on the auto industry, took on General Motors, which is the most powerful U.S. industry at the time, over auto safety and highway safety regulations. And Ralph Nader won. And this is during a period of time when, a motto in the U.S. was, what's good for GM is good for the country. Ralph Nader defeated them, which shows, one, how much influence Ralph Nader and consumer groups had in that period, but also how little influence companies had. General Motors barely had a lobbying operation in D.C. and got crushed by Ralph Nader and consumer groups.
So you're describing kind of this scenario where even giant companies like General Motors would basically get flattened by like a really pesky individual like Ralph Nader, and that lobbying operations just were not big, they were not complex, they were not sophisticated, they barely existed. And we compare that to the current day when like there's billions of dollars being thrown into lobbying. I don't know the exact numbers. I assume it's huge.
Billions is correct, yeah.
But so my question is, how did we get there? Like, how did we move from point A to point B? What happened? How did money get everywhere?
Yeah, the shift was really the economic decline in the 1970s, when companies went from thinking that laws and regulations are created in this far off place called Washington, D.C., and the companies just dealt with them, to companies, to sort of light bulb going off and companies saying, wait a second, we can go impact and influence and change and block those new regulations in order to help themselves and hurt competitors. So they really went from not being involved in Washington to coming to Washington full force to try to bend rules and regulations to their liking.
One of the most kind of striking things about the book is I guess I'll call them the intimate details of how this happened, because you really spend a long time kind of marinating, I'll say, in the particulars of how like particular characters started their lobbying shops and grew them. And, there's a lot of larger than life characters here who, in fact, some of our younger listeners may not even recognize that these people were influential in politics before Trump. But, people like Roger Stone and Paul Manafort, people like Tony Podesta. And it really, one of the things that struck me was that a lot of these characters really were kind of larger than life. And the way you talk about them almost makes lobbying seem very, very attractive. These going out for expensive dinners with seafood towers and steaks and ordering $1,000 bottles of champagne and crazy parties where congressmen and CEOs are showing up. And it kind of seemed like lobbying very much had a frat house era of like excess. And, and I don't know what else to call it. I guess excess is the word. How much of that was, the image that they really wanted to portray of like, we're these really cool, influential people. We have all this lavish lifestyle. And how much of it was like, no, they were actually living like that?
I think they were really living like that. I mean, a lot of the stuff that we talk about in terms of the sort of Mad Men era was the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, sort of, pre-Me Too, Mad Men era. And, this lobbying industry, corporate lobbying industry, was not that old. So a lot of the players who were involved, including Tommy Boggs when he first started, was a very young man, and all of a sudden was making tons of money and liked to throw around that money and be a star. Paul Manafort was the same. When Paul Manafort and Roger Stone founded their lobbying firm in 1980, they were 30 and 31 years old, and all of a sudden they're representing Rupert Murdoch and TWA and Carl Icahn and Solomon Brothers and big Wall Street players, even Donald Trump. They're making millions of dollars as 31-year-olds, so they're partying all night. They're working hard all day. There's definitely some Mad Men behavior there. I think that's cooled off more recently because there's now more scrutiny by the press of the lobbying industry, and just, standards have changed. But there was definitely that sort of mentality for many years. I mean, these were basically cowboys, and they're working in a relatively lawless industry, making tons of money at a very young age.
Do you think that some of that still kind of persists, or do you think that lobbying has become more like professionalized, the more buttoned up and corporate in its kind of behaviors?
It's 100% more buttoned up in its behaviors, but that doesn't mean that you can't find examples of the cowboy mentality. As a reporter covering lobbying, that's what I'm looking for. Those fun stories about lobbyists or living over the top. And in fact, this guy, Evan Morris, was one of them. When he died, he was just 38 years old. So there are other players out there like that who still sort of push and bend the rules.
When I think about this, I'm an outsider in the world of lobbying. I don't know that much about it. I don't know that much about how these things go down. But part of me thinks that this kind of rise of lobbying was somewhat inevitable in just the rise of big money in politics in general, because it's not just a lobbying where money in politics has exploded. The cost to run a presidential campaign has exploded. The amount of advertising that we see has exploded. And it's like money in politics is now bigger than it ever was across every field that could be true in. Do you think that this is kind of just inevitable in terms of like, we've got like 2-year presidential cycles? Of course, there's going to be billions of dollars thrown around.
Yeah, it's hard to tell, whether it's the chicken or the egg, but, certainly it's possible to blame the television industry for sort of starting this rush for money. Once the broadcast stations started charging so much for campaign commercials, once there's so much demand for campaign commercials, lawmakers needed a ton of money. In fact, we write about in the book that in the 1960s and 1970s, the cost of running for Congress was $30 or $40 or $50,000. Now it's $1 million or $2 million or $10 million. And in order to get that money, you've got to go to, where the money is, and lobbyists have the money. Lobbyists have, connections to hundreds, if not thousands, of corporate executives and other wealthy people who can funnel money through lobbyists to members of Congress, and that gives lobbyists a tremendous amount of access to members of Congress, and also gives them a tremendous amount of influence, because if a lawmaker to get reelected needs money, they have to go to the lobbyist, and therefore the lobbyist becomes important, and you need to sort of listen to what they're saying.
My dream here is that we just cut short the election times. Like, I don't know about you, but I look at like France, where they just, Macron called an election and within 2 weeks they'd like had the election. I look at that and I'm like, that would be a great way to get a 90% of the money out of politics, is to have a 2-week election cycle. But I don't know that we can actually make that happen constitutionally.
It's not a bad idea. Another great idea is just, getting money out of politics overall and having public elections, but that's just not going to happen either. I mean, part of the problem, which is not a problem, is the First Amendment. And under the First Amendment, people have the right to free speech, and campaign donations are now considered free speech. So you can't block someone from exercising their right to free speech by giving a campaign donation to someone at any time. So even if you had 2 weeks election cycles are 2 weeks long, people would start donating 3 weeks out, and then 4 weeks out, and then a year out. It ended up being the same thing.
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of this is self-inflicted, but I think it's probably, just personally, I think it's probably a good thing the way we've structured our First Amendment. But I will admit that it comes with messiness. That's part of the deal with free speech. So there are some messy side effects. But so the book kind of presents this picture of how lobbyists influence members of Congress. And I wonder if you could kind of walk us through that. You did a little bit of that just a second ago, but there's conflicting studies I've seen on this, where like some people argue that actually money doesn't actually have the effect you think it does in politics, where it doesn't actually have very much of an impact on elections, because it's not so much that that you need money to get elected. It's more that companies donate to the person they already know is going to win, and that's what drives a lot of this. But from your perspective, just at a high level, how do you see the influence of kind of all this lobbying money from big corporations? How does it work, and how does it actually influence things? And how would you describe that?
It's definitely true that money doesn't always win, but money usually wins. Members of Congress are elected on every 2 years, and from the second they're elected, they start raising money. And the idea is that you want to have $1 million or $2 million in the bank going into the next election, so that anyone who tries to oppose you is going to be scared away by the amount of money you have, and by how hard it is to catch up to the incumbent. That's the sort of what you were alluding to a second ago, is that companies want to be with the winner. They really don't care if the winner is a Republican or a Democrat. So they give money to the incumbent. And a fascinating stat in campaign finance is that when Democrats are in charge of the House and Senate, corporate PACs tend to give about 60% of their money to Democrats and 40% to Republicans. And when Republicans are in charge of the House and Senate, that number simply switches. You would think that Republicans being more, Republicans being more pro-business, that businesses would want them to be in power and would always support them. But that's not true. If Democrats are in power, they give money to Democrats. They just want to have friends in power, so they give money to both sides, and that's what makes this so pernicious. That if you go outside of D.C. and you say to Democrats, what's wrong with Washington, they blame Republicans, and you talk to Republicans, and they blame Democrats. Companies don't care. They want to be in bed with both sides, so they're always winning.
The book talks about many of the instances of I'll say big events in lobbying history when a particular bill was passed or not passed or adjusted, or when an executive agency of some kind was persuaded to not kind of take an action or to take an action. What are some of the ones that stand out in your mind as a really good example? Because I'm sure you could talk for hours and hours about all these different examples of how lobbying funds are actually spent and how they actually change policies and how they actually impact things. But are there one or two that you think would be, for a short 1 hour podcast, that would be the good examples to toss out there that really illustrate the point?
Yeah. So, I could talk for hours, but that's kind of goes to how we're putting this book together. We didn't write a history of lobbying. We don't have every single fight. We only write about the key pivot points. And I can give you a couple of them. A really good one was 1993. 1993 was a point when the corporate lobby really took off, flexed their muscles, and showed that they could be as powerful, if not more powerful, than the President of the United States and Congress. So in 1992, Bill Clinton gets elected. He comes to Washington, is inaugurated in early 1993. He wasn't the most popularly elected president. He only won with 43% of the vote because Ross Perot was running. But nevertheless, it's his honeymoon period when presidents usually can get one big thing done. And he picked as his top priority national healthcare reform. He decided he wanted to be a big liberal Democrat in the line of LBJ and JFK and get done what those two presidents and others couldn't get done, which was creating a national healthcare system for all Americans. At the time, Clinton is president. Democrats have control of the House. Democrats have control of the Senate. And 70% of Americans, according to a Gallup poll at the time, said they were not happy with their current healthcare plans. So it looked like this is something that could really get done. To add one more thing, this was not a hugely partisan issue at the time. The prior year, something like 17 Senate Republicans had their own bill on to create a national healthcare plan. So it was not, it was not analogous to the Democratic plan, but at least 17 Republicans said we should do this, even though they had a different path to do so. So the point is, this really could have happened. And so Bill Clinton introduces his legislation, his plan, and starts moving forward. And all of a sudden, the corporate lobby gets involved, and in particular, health insurance companies. Health insurance companies saw that if the government created a health insurance plan that competed with their private plans, they would lose customers who could drive down prices, and many would go out of business. So they faced an existential threat. As a result, they just poured everything they had into this huge lobbying campaign against the Clinton healthcare plan. They basically ran a presidential campaign against Bill Clinton's plan, using polling, using campaign ads, using lobbyists, using strategists. In fact, it was so much like a presidential campaign that when Bill Clinton ran for election in 1992, he spent about $100 million getting elected. The health insurance industry spent about $100 million defeating his national healthcare plan. They defeated it so soundly that his plan never even had a vote on the House floor or on the Senate floor. It was crushed in committee. And what was fascinating about that moment, and the reason we write about it, is not only that what I said is that the industry was more powerful than the president and Congress, but it fundamentally changed Bill Clinton's presidency. He came in thinking he could be a liberal Democrat. Instead, after getting his butt kicked by industry, he sort of shifted. He moved to the middle. He tried to be a more pro-business, centrist Republican. If you remember, he talked about triangulating. His strategy was to triangulate the parties. And what he's known for for the rest of his administration is enacting policies and laws that were more pro-business and almost sounded Republican. NAFTA, free trade. He balanced the budget and reformed welfare. Reforming welfare had long been a Republican priority. So he became sort of a centrist president because of that loss to the health insurance lobbies. That's a really good example we use as how the lobbies changed politics fundamentally.
One thing that's interesting in the book is that there's kind of an old style of lobbying, which is what a lot of people probably think, and it's what we've talked about a little bit, which is, I promise that I can get a bunch of campaign donations to you if you vote the way I want you to vote on this bill, or maybe I take you out on a nice hunting trip and we have a bunch of nice wine and I ply you with gifts to some extent, and there's ethics rules, but there's also ways you can get around the ethics rules, and it's basically you shower them with money and attention and they'll do what you want. But it seems like that's kind of an older style, and in recent days there's been what you call the outside game, which is a form of lobbying that is very different than that does not focus on individually showering a senator with gifts. How would you describe the outside game?
Yeah, you're exactly right. So our book is really fundamentally about two things. It's about how companies came to power in Washington, but it's also how companies have changed lobbying tactics to be successful over the last 50 years. So in the beginning, lobbying was just like you said it was. There's a few members of Congress who hold all the power and a few lobbyists who, using gifts and using steak dinners and using campaign checks and using golf outings, had relationships with those members of Congress and could get favors for their clients. That era certainly
going into the smoke-filled rooms, right?
Exactly. And we write about 5 lobbyists who sort of show how lobbying has changed. The first lobbyist we write about is Tommy Boggs. Tommy Boggs was a cigar-chomping son of a former member of Congress. He was creating the smoke in the smoke-filled room, as it were. Tommy Boggs grew up with his dad being the Senate or the House Majority Leader. When his dad disappeared in a plane crash in Alaska, the citizens of Louisiana elected his mom to be a member of Congress. So he grew up with both his mom and his dad as powerful members of Congress. They were friends with LBJ and JFK and Speaker Sam Rayburn. And so young Tommy Boggs, when he decided to become a lobbyist, knew personally all the players who made laws and legislation. And he basically traded on those relationships to get tons of contracts for big companies and get things done for them. That era started to change in the 1970s and 1980s, and lobbying started to move more outside of D.C., cutting to where we are now. Members of Congress now, because of this scrutiny by their political opponents and by reporters, members of Congress are reluctant to do favors for their top lobbyists or for their friends or their campaign donors, because people like me would love to write stories about that. We're always looking for someone doing a favor for a corporate lobbyist. So what we do know, though, is that members of Congress will do anything they can to get reelected. And to get reelected, you need the support of 51% of your constituents. And lobbyists have figured that out. So while they still talk directly to members of Congress, they spend a lot of their time outside of Washington in the districts of key members of Congress trying to rally support for corporate causes among regular Americans. And the idea is that if regular Americans, or if 51% of Americans in a member of Congress's district, support free trade with China, then the member of Congress is going to follow because they're going to do whatever they can to get reelected. So lobbying has really moved from that smoke-filled room really outside of Washington. And one of the main problems there is that under the lobbying disclosure laws, which are really the only laws that govern lobbying, people who spend their time talking directly to members of Congress and government officials on policy or legislation have to fill out a quarterly report saying that they are a lobbyist. And those reports say who they're lobbying, what issues they're lobbying on, how much money they're getting paid to lobby. And those are the people who the public know of as lobbyists. Well, the new type of lobbying, which is sort of influencing peddling out in the state outside of DC, does not fall under that definition of lobbying. so that even though the lobbying industry, the influence industry has been exploding for the last 20 or 30 years, the number of registered lobbyists is actually flat. So in Washington, D.C. in 2007, I believe, there was something like 11 or 12,000 lobbyists, according to the law. Today, there's something around 11 or 12,000 lobbyists. And there's no way that the lobbying industry has been flat during that time. It's just that lobbying is moving to a way outside of D.C. where lobbyists don't have to disclose what they're doing.
And I mean, to me, that almost sounds positive. Like it's an improvement that people are actually having to take their opinions to the people. And, if the public agrees, then maybe they've got a case. But it's harder, in my mind, to get actual constituents to agree to something en masse than it is to, just, well, here's a backroom handshake with a fistful of money. And therefore you're going to vote the way I want. Like, to me, this actually seems like, this is kind of how the system should be. If you're going to be spending money, it should be to convince the public writ large.
You know what? I actually agree with you. I think that's right. It's more democratic. I mean, it means that if the member of Congress is doing what their constituents want, then the government is working. There's two problems. One is that the lobbying disclosure law is supposed to let Americans know who is trying to influence their policy, what companies or countries, what foreign countries are out there trying to influence or change legislation to help them in ways that may hurt consumers. And that law now is antiquated and outdated because it doesn't cover where the lobbying is right now. So that's one problem. Another problem is that, as we talked about a little bit earlier, the Ralph Naders of the world, the consumer groups are not around anymore. The labor unions don't have the influence they used to have. And some of these progressive groups just don't have the power to match corporate lobbyists. So when you say, yes, it's good for citizens to sort of run the government, for members of Congress to react to citizens, the only people out there trying to press, or the people who have the most resources to press constituents on behalf of interest groups are companies. The other side just doesn't have the resources to match that. So you really only have corporate America out there pushing really hard for pro-industry positions, and not the other side.
I mean, there's some degree of truth to that. I would take slight issue with that in just being inside Democratic politics myself. And if you've existed in Democratic politics, the importance of the groups, all of them, the environmental groups, the identity-based groups, whether it's LGBT groups or Black caucus, Hispanic caucus, that kind of thing. Like, the importance of the groups, whether or not they have as much money as like business lobbyists, the groups are still punch way above their weight in terms of how much money they have to how much influence they have. I think that's still a really important. Like, you can't make a decision in Democratic politics without consulting all the groups, and it's actually kind of a problem sometimes.
Right. No, that's definitely true. I guess I meant, if you look at the money, that companies are outspending the other side, 10 to 1, sometimes 100 to 1. I mean, yes, those a lot of the liberal groups punch above their weight, but the companies have the weight.
Fair enough. And so this is kind of the part of the podcast where I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit, because it would be a boring podcast if I just, nodded along and agreed with you on every single point. So one of the things I want to talk about is, how do we think about this in the larger sense? Because lobbying as the idea of just, citizens and interest groups writ large, whether that's groups like environmental groups or whether it's a company, they should have the ability to appeal to their government. Like I said, that's a tradition that goes back to when we had kings and emperors and stuff. You could always appeal to the man in charge. But there's kind of this idea of that being that there could be good lobbying and there can be bad lobbying. There can be lobbying where somebody just wants to extract rent and, just get a bunch of special breaks for themselves. There could be lobbying that is just genuinely trying to make better policy. Somebody noticed that, oh, this one department is not doing things the right way. If you do it this other way, it'll be better. How can we? Is it even possible to kind of draw a boundary between good lobbying and bad lobbying?
Yeah. So, we're not writing specifically about lobbying and saying lobbying is bad. We're writing about corporations and their power. And, what we find is that companies are spending a ton of money to bend legislation in ways that help companies at the expense of consumers and the rest of us. And, that's a reason that we have such high income income inequality these days, that executives are doing so well, that companies are doing so well, and the rest of us, don't seem to be doing as well. Back to what we were saying before, the founding fathers saw that there would be these interest groups fighting. I think what they didn't see is that how much more power one side had over the other, and that's what makes things unfair. And even if you look at the Republican Party, I think a lot of Republicans now, or some Republicans, are becoming more populist and now bashing big companies and bashing the Chamber of Commerce, very much because of what you just said, that they believe that companies should be fighting it out in the marketplace and having the best company win. Instead, some of the biggest companies run to Washington, hire lobbyists, and change the rules to help themselves and hurt other smaller industries. I mean, there's a reason that I think Republicans are upset because some Republicans are upset because they believe that some of these big companies are using lobbyists and using campaign donations so that we have a world in which, or a country in which, there's 5 big insurance companies, there's 5 big banks, there's 5 big tech companies, 5 big airlines, there's 5 big railroads. There's not the competition that there used to be. And I think that's why so many Republicans are now turning on the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. I mean, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce for my entire lifetime, represented and spoke for corporate America and the Republican Party. They were all on the same team. And in the last couple of years, you see Donald Trump turning against the Chamber of Commerce. You see some House leaders turning against the Chamber of Commerce because they believe the Chamber of Commerce sort of represents big companies who spend millions of dollars to run to Washington to change the rules rather than fight it out fairly in the marketplace.
One of the examples in your book that's walked through in some detail of kind of how it went down is the bills called SOPA and PIPA. And these were bills from, I believe, the Obama administration, where it was an internet-related bill related to privacy. And I won't get into too much of it, but from my perspective and from a lot of people's perspective, these were genuinely really, really awful bills that had a majority of support in Congress, and they looked like they were definitely going to pass. And basically all the tech companies, as you detail in the book, got together and spent a ton of money and rallied a bunch of internet users and kind of shut the internet down for a day. Wikipedia shut down, Google shut down, Reddit shut down. A lot of these places all said the internet is in danger. And they ended up getting people to call Congress like en masse. And it was one of the biggest events of like the public being outraged by a bill in quite a while. And it ended up killing the bills, killing SOPA and PIPA. And from my perspective, that's actually a really good thing, because this was an instance of like, Washington and Congress just literally don't understand how technology works. And they were about to pass something that would have been really destructive. And that's an instance, and I don't want to like shill too hard for the tech companies, but that's an instance of where I think like corporate lobbying was actually really, really useful. And of course, there are other instances where, somebody just says, hey, I'd like a tax break for my company that only applies to me. I'd like you to put out, I'm the only company that builds this specific kind of tank, and I'd like you to order 300 more of them through the Department of Defense. Like there's very corrupt things you can do. But I think even corporate lobbying can have a positive impact. And I'm kind of just wondering, like, how do we grapple with that?
Yeah, we're not running a history of lobbying. We're picking particular examples that show that illustrate points we want to make. And here there is 2 or 3 points in this SOPA PIPA fight. One is, dovetailing off of what we just said. This was not a big policy concern at the time. This was a entrenched Washington industries, Hollywood, Rupert Murdoch, copyright holders, the Chamber of Commerce, and pharmaceutical industry that saw a business threat in the tech industry, and they wanted to snuff it out. So they created this bill that would basically screw over their competitors. They would try to change the rules of the marketplace to gain an advantage of using their advantage, which was their lobbying might in Washington. Instead of battling in the market, they saw themselves losing in the long term in the marketplace. So they came to Washington to change the rules. That seems to be problematic. But two, that the second reason we wrote about this episode is that these companies at the time, the big tech companies in 2012, were not big tech companies. They were upstart companies. They were just getting started. They did not have the lobbying might. They did not have the campaign donations. They did not have the lobbying spend. So what they did was they went out to the people, and they rallied the people to defeat these more entrenched lobbies. And that's kind of another reason we write about it. And the third reason we write about this example is that by leveraging regular Americans and consumers and getting them involved in a big, expensive lobbying fight in Washington, they established themselves as the most powerful force in Washington. I mean, this lobbying fight created big tech. I mean, ever since then, members of Congress are wary or concerned about big tech crushing them. So we're not saying that this was a bad episode. We're sort of writing about it as a new tactic that big tech used, and a tactic that their opponents use just to try to screw with them by changing the law.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to get, I guess, to the kind of the higher level philosophy of this, and that's not really the central point of the book. The book is more of a history. It's more of a details filled kind of accounting of what happened, more than it is a book of philosophy. But there are some kind of unstated assumptions in the book, and one of them is that the rise of corporate lobbying power in America has not been for good, I think is kind of the undertone of the book. And I'm just trying to kind of think about, well, what should it be then? If the current system is not ideal, what would an ideal system look like? Is it possible to get the good kinds of lobbying that just say, hey, maybe we should change our zoning code so that we can allow single stair buildings because that's a good thing to do. And yes, I'm a business interest. I own a bunch of apartments, but really this is actually a smart policy to do. There's that kind of lobbying, and then there's just like award me this contract corruptly,
right,
and lock in my advantage so I don't have to compete, and that kind of lobbying. And I'm I'm like a theorist. I just want to know, like, what should we do about it to some extent?
Yeah, it's hard to come up with a good solution, but I mean, the point of that example is that the consumers, that Americans and constituents ultimately have the power to overcome more entrenched lobbies in DC. And if you're looking for a solution, it's that someone needs to come along and really rally and organize consumers and sort of band them together in an organized way. The way the companies are. I mean, companies have so much money and they're so organized. They know exactly what they want. And they're trying to manipulate public opinion and use campaign donations to get to members of Congress. And the people who really have the power are sort of disorganized and oftentimes unable to fight back. Resulting in companies getting policies that they want and consumers losing.
One thing I'm curious about, and this is totally not related to your book, but I bet you would have an interesting perspective on it, is the big TikTok call-in that happened recently, because Congress has been thinking about banning TikTok because some of them it's a privacy thing, some of them it's we don't want China controlling one of our great information vectors in our country. And TikTok got a bunch of people to call in. TikTok, this was like a big outside game kind of thing. And I'm sure they had a bunch of lobbyists. TikTok has an enormous number of lobbyists in Washington, D.C., actually. And it backfired spectacularly. It pissed everyone off that all these TikTok teenagers were calling their offices. When you saw that, did you have I'm just curious what your reaction was as somebody who's been writing about this.
Yeah, my reaction was, what a great tactic. TikTok's going to win. And then, it blew up in their face, which is kind of amazing that, they're obviously borrowing this Google tactic that works spectacularly. And here they pull it out 10 years later and it fails. And I don't know the reason. It might be that members of Congress we're sort of wary of of calls like that now. They see them as being generated by companies, or maybe the Chinese ties to TikTok made them wary of doing anything that would support TikTok. It's really hard to say. It's a great question though.
The things that I've heard, and this is I am not some super well connected insider. I'm sure you have better connections than I do, but I know a couple people, and I've heard things like, we had teenagers calling who were clearly not even voting age, saying they would kill themselves if we banned TikTok. And that does not have the effect that they think it has, Yeah. That only convinces me TikTok is a problem even more. And then just the second thing is that, look, if the complaint is China has too much influence on our most important communication platform. And then this happens and they're flooded by calls. That doesn't convince them that China no longer has it. That makes them even more worried, I guess.
That's actually the best point. I think that's probably the answer, that exactly what you just said, that this is the concern. Like, how is China using soft power to influence Americans through movies and communications and the media? And here's an example that's just like, bold and naked and right in front of us. So maybe that's why people are so skeptical of it.
One of the other things that I think about when I think about this is, like, sometimes it's possible to, like, glide between two ideas. The idea of, like, pro-business in general, like free market stuff, and then kind of pro-corporate. I'm doing a favor for one corporation. And part of me wonders, again, as kind of like this high-minded political theorist guy who just gets to talk on podcasts all the time, like, how do even if you are pro-business, how do you make sure that you're enacting pro-business without being pro-corporate, if that makes sense? That is just like, we want a good business environment that's fair to everybody.
I don't know the answer, but I think that's exactly what the Republican Party is wrestling with right now. I think there are an increasing number of free market / populist Republicans in the House and Senate who are starting to think that these pro-business parts of the Republican Party are not pro-free market. They're just pro-big business. I think that's where the tension is. I think that's why Republicans are taking on the Chamber of Commerce, who they see as not free market at all, but pro-business.
I see kind of the opposite movement, actually. And I'll only say that in the context of Donald Trump, just because, like, Trump hates the Chamber of Commerce, but not for any sort of principled reason. He hates it because they backed his opponents in 2016. At any business that sucks up to Trump, he's a vain narcissist. He will just do whatever they want as long as they suck up to him. Like, for him, it's very, very He's probably the most lobbyable politician that there's ever been, right? You give him money and he's happy.
You hire one of his former aides, and that's what happened with TikTok, right? That TikTok hired 2 or 3 of his former aides, and he literally did a 100% flip.
Yeah, one of his biggest donors is has a 10% stake or something like that in TikTok.
That's Granite Capital.
One of the other things that I wanted to ask, we're coming up on time soon, but before we get out of here, you kind of mentioned the idea that if this flood of corporate money is going to be reversed, it's not that we can really stop the corporate money. It's that we need to organize a countervailing force, right? Corporate power wouldn't be such a big deal if we had other big power centers competing for influence, right?
Right.
If it was one among many power centers. Do you see any hint of that happening? Because I do, from my perspective, I see that there's, like, increasingly crowdfunding is now the way that, like, many members of Congress are raising their funds. They're not appealing. They're actually not taking money from PACs, and they're just, through the power of social media and the internet, they're super popular there. And maybe it's a small number for now, but that seems to be growing.
Yeah, what I see is an increasing number of populist Republicans partnering with progressive Democrats on anti-corporate measures. A good example is Josh Hawley, the Republican from Missouri, who's incredibly conservative, big fan of Trump. Yet he has sponsored recently 3 bills with Elizabeth Warren. One that would block failed banks, executives at failed banks from getting bonuses, another that would cap credit card fees, and a third that would make it easier for individuals to join labor unions. But these are all, like, Elizabeth Warren ideas, and you've got Josh Hawley involved in those. And not just Josh Hawley, but J.D. Vance, who might be, in a few days, Donald Trump's vice presidential nominee.
This is like my nightmare blunt rotation, by the way.
But those guys, and there's women also in the Senate who are more populist. If they team up on pro-consumer, pro-worker legislation, that is a countervailing force. I think it's new, and I think it's growing. In every election, we have to see if it's getting bigger or smaller. But let me give you another example. About a year and a half ago, there was a bill that became law, but it's a bill in the House that would increase fees on companies that are merging. And so when 2 companies merge, they pay a certain fee. That fee goes to antitrust regulators at the Justice Department and at the Federal Trade Commission. who literally hired people to review, and or block corporate mergers. So this is a bill that would increase that fee, as in take money from big U.S. companies, give it to federal regulators to try to block and enforce antitrust law and block corporate mergers. And the point is that 39 House Republicans voted for that bill. I mean, that's an issue that in my lifetime, I've never seen Republicans take money from companies to give to bureaucrats to block corporate activity. And here's 40 of them. Those people are teaming up with Democrats. I mean, that's a pro-worker, anti-corporate idea. I don't think that was an aberration. I think there'll be more and more pieces of legislation like that, more and more partnerships like that, unusual bedfellows. And if so, that's a countervailing force.
Antitrust is one of those areas, again, where you see sometimes that like Hawley, Warren axis of kind of like strange bedfellows. And I have my own weird thoughts about antitrust. I think they focus way too much on big tech and not on like boring industries. Because like my take is that they should spend more time looking at like hospital conglomerates and stuff like medical manufacturers. But going after medical manufacturers is not as sexy as going after like Google or Meta. So they spend a lot of time doing that.
Absolutely.
I'm kind of cynical about that, but that's my bespoke take on like they need to go after the boring industries instead of like big tech is sexy to go after big tech.
I agree with that, but there are bills and efforts by Republicans to go after Ticketmaster because they think they're a monopoly and jack up prices, to go after the poultry industry and the meatpacking industry out in the Midwest, and airlines are increasing under fire at DOJ these days, and even this merger between grocery stores, the Kroger and Albertsons merger, which is one that we don't talk about much on the East Coast because it's a southern chain, but it's a huge grocery store chain. Two big ones they're merging, and a number of Republicans have come out against it because they think it'll reduce jobs.
And no, I'm all in favor of the Ticketmaster thing. I don't think you'll find anybody who defends Ticketmaster who's not being paid to defend. Like, if there's a pro Ticketmaster stance, I feel like it's pretty reliable. That person is getting money from Live Nation Ticketmaster. They are like, it just seems like one of the most hated businesses in America. But not to jump on that hobby horse. But so we are coming up on time. This is a really fascinating conversation. I want to close with the traditional final question that we always ask here on this podcast, and that is, where can people go to learn more? I will be happy to recommend the book itself. The book is The Wolves of K Street. It's by Brody Mullins and also Luke Mullins. Is that right?
That's right. Luke is my brother.
So it's a family affair. The Wolves of K Street is this history of how lobbying developed into what it is today. But other than your own book, if people are interested in what we're talking about today, whether it's the figures involved or corporate lobbying in general, what else would you recommend for them if they're interested in learning more?
This is an odd one, but I do a lot of my work by going to opensecrets.org, which is an organization that pulls lobbying data and campaign finance data from companies and other organizations and puts them online in a very readable and accessible way, where within a few seconds you can see a chart of who are the companies who are spending the most, who are the companies who are making the most campaign donations, who are the members of Congress who are receiving the most money from corporate America. I mean, it's a good way of going right to the source to figure out who are the big players in politics and what they're doing.
Love Open Secrets, really useful site. So I can second that. And I just want to say thank you one more time to our guest on this episode, Brody Mullins. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. Great conversation.